Daniel LeBlanc left France as a 19-year-old for what is now Canada. Likely a peasant farmer, he would face civil war, political maneuvering at the highest levels, and leave a mark on Canada and the rest of the globe. The search for a headstone started out by investigating one of the oldest cemeteries in Canada. The headstone, in fact, didn't exist at all, but there's no doubt about one of the graves in the Fort Anne Garrison graveyard. There are more than 2,000 people buried here, and yet only 234 English grave markers stand today. The Acadians were those that initially settled from France on the eastern shores of what is now Canada and the northeast US. They had wooden crosses that have decayed and disappeared over time. The story of the Acadians is well known, but Daniel LeBlanc's story would be more challenging. There were theories that Daniel was derived from nobility in France, but that doesn't appear to be true. His life in France before immigrating would likely remain a mystery. The seigneurial system that was brought from France to manage land leases in New France was oppressive but very well documented. There are multiple censuses of the Acadian people. Daniel's life is closely intertwined with the history of early settlement in Canada and the Northeast United States. It's going to be far more interesting than originally thought. Daniel LeBlanc was likely a French peasant born in the small village of Martaizé, France. His family would have farmed on the lands leased from the mother of Seigneur Charle de Menou d'Aulnay. Daniel was likely not in line to have inherited the family farm. His fortunes would need to be made elsewhere. That elsewhere was 4,500 kilometers across the ocean. Seigneur Charle de Menou d'Aulnay was of French nobility and an adventurer. He had interests in New France and actively recruited from peasants on his mother's land to start a new life across the Atlantic. Daniel was likely recruited at this time, as was his future wife, Francoise Gaudet, and many others. New France was the name for what is now the east coast of Canada. Earlier explorers like Jean Cabot had already established relations with the original Mi'kmaq indigenous peoples of the area, who welcomed the settlers, unlike indigenous people to the south. The reports back to Europe had been that the oceans were full of cod and land filled with fur-bearing animals. These tales of riches captured the interest of many explorers who followed. Daniel likely took the 3-month voyage from France to New France in about 1645. He would have arrived in Port Royal at what is now known as Nova Scotia. He arrived in the middle of a civil war between D'Aulnay and Governor Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour. Each had been granted territories by King Louis XIV, and a series of battles ensued to attempt total control. Daniel's arrival was as a farmer, but also to bolster D'Aulnay's numbers. Daniel settled 15 kilometers upriver from Port Royal in an area that had trees and farmland. He married Francoise Gaudet, a recent widow with a daughter Marie from her previous marriage sometime in 1650. Daniel would have been granted land, seed, equipment, and livestock in exchange for a portion of the harvest to the seigneur. By all accounts, Daniel was a successful farmer and politically astute. Daniel and Francois had a son Jacques in 1651, daughter Marie-Francoise in 1652, and son Etienne in 1656. Their family expanded with the births of René, André, Antoine, and Pierre. As was the custom for Acadians at the time, youngest son Pierre would eventually inherit the family farm. Meanwhile, the battles for land and power raged on. D'Aulnay, who had recruited Daniel, had become governor of Acadia after many battles. In 1650, though, he died when his canoe capsized at about age 45. This threw the title of who ran Acadia into question. The question was eventually resolved when D'Aulnay's fiercest enemy, Latour, returned to marry D'Aulnay's wife on the 24th of February, 1653. The peace only lasted 1 year when the British came and conquered Port Royal and took Latour back to England. By 1656 he had negotiated with Oliver Cromwell to retain his title in exchange for English allegiance. This was the beginning of a switch from the feudal system of the French, where a lord leased land to farmers, to a system where the farmers owned their own land. By 1671, Daniel was listed as having a farm of 10 arpents, roughly 10 acres, 18 cattle and 26 sheep. He lived with his wife and 7 children. Oldest daughter Marie Francoise had married Martin Blanchard, who was 6 years older and had already started a farm. 7 years later, only 3 sons remained at home with Daniel and Francois. All the other children had married and started farms of their own. Son Etienne, though, was believed to have gone to work on the battleships and was believed to be lost. Around 1690, Daniel became a member of a group of 6 commissioners that provided oversight for the colony. In 1695, after a regime change, LeBlanc signed an oath of allegiance to the King of England. Daniel's sons Jacques, André, Jean, René, and Antoine were granted the right to bear arms, which likely meant that they were some of the leaders in the growing community. The LeBlanc family became one of the most important original settlement families of Canada. Daniel died sometime between 1695 and 1698, and Francois a few years later. Daniel LeBlanc, it was a pleasure to meet you.